Well, I'm delighted to be speaking to a home audience this evening. I've just given 3 talks to members
Can you
of...
speak into the mic,
yeah,
please?
okay, yeah, no problem, sorry. I've had the advantage of actually miking the last week, so it may take me staying in place, which I'm not very good at. So, I am very pleased to be speaking to a home audience. I am resident for at least a quarter of the year in St. Catharines. My work tends to take me far and beyond, or at least within the province of Ontario at present. I am working, as Penny had stated, for both Trent and Brock University, which keep me fairly busy, working on a number of archaeological field projects and developing field programs for both universities. So today I'm going to speak on certainly my favorite topic, which is shipwrecks, and also give you basically the 2 projects I'm currently working on. I've had a long period of work within the Great Lakes region, focusing on shipwrecks from Lakes Ontario, Huron, and Superior, but I'd like to focus on the work that I've done in the last 2 years, again through Trent and Brock. We are developing programs at Penetanguishene and also with regard to the archaeology of a shipyard at St. Catharines. So I'm going to tell you about both projects and give you at least a taster on what we're doing, and perhaps if you're interested how to reach out and join us. All right? Next. So if you were to describe me, I would say I was a historical maritime archaeologist, which means my favorite period of exploration is after 1500. So I looked at, over the last 25 years, shipwrecks from the British Isles. I was based in the UK for 13 years and looked at a number of shipwrecks off the British coastline, from Royal Navy fire ships, 17th century Royal Navy fire ships, to shipwrecks in Bermuda. Taking me down to the Caribbean, where we did work on a number of ships, again from the colonial period, and also that's also led me to work on traditional boats within the Lesser Antilles, within the Caribbean basin, where we've been helping to record some of these lost, the lost traditions of boat building within the Caribbean basin. So my interests are wide, but they tend to come back to boats and bits of boat. So I'll be speaking obviously about bits of boat and obviously the infrastructures which house boats this evening. Next. Of course, a lot of my work has been within the Great Lakes. So I've talked about Caribbean, and you probably imagine the surprise at why I would be wanting to work here when the rum is plenty in the Caribbean and ultimately the water temperatures are gin clear and a bit warmer. So, but the Great Lakes has always been at the heart of what I've done. I started as a student at Western Ontario many years ago, and as someone who was an avid diver of shipwrecks, I wanted to learn how to become a historical maritime archaeologist. But at that time, and even now, there is no university program in maritime archaeology. There is nowhere to study the subject. And so I returned to Canada after being abroad 2 years ago to establish such a program, to introduce the subject of historical maritime archaeology within university programs here in Ontario. And so part and parcel of that is to train the next generation of archaeologists in methods on how to record shipwrecks, but also to understand the importance of maritime heritage, of course, to our historic landscape. To understand the importance of shipwrecks, such as those in Tobermory or elsewhere in the Great Lakes, and how they connect us, of course, not only geographically to the Great Lakes region, but internationally speaking. These ships, which connected us through routes throughout the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway, connected, of course, to the Atlantic networks and even a wider world. And so it's my privilege, of course, to work on our Ontario's heritage, both above and below the waterline. And I'm excited to obviously share with you these 2 projects that we are currently working and involving our students to train them in these skills. Next. So So the first project that I'm going to talk about is work that we are currently doing here on Georgian Bay, and focusing on the material of the provincial marine. Of course, last year the one talk that I was able to attend was regarding the Nancy, and of course she was part of the depot at Nottawasaga. And again, one of the vessels that served, of course, the Provincial Marine during the period of war in 1812. And ultimately what I'm interested in, or certainly what I was interested in back 2 years ago when I began this quest, I wanted to connect the research I'd done in the UK. My PhD had been on the archaeology of small warships, on specifically sloops of war that were unrated warships of the Royal Navy between the period of 1650 and 1850. So I wanted to take that research forward, but I wanted to focus it, of course, in my backyard and within the Great Lakes region. So the wonders, of course, of Discovery Harbour and the collections housed within Discovery Harbour were such that I was able to do it, not only on land, but actually right in their waterways, and to connect our students into shallow water shipwrecks, but not only the opportunity to train them those skills, but to help Discovery Harbour in their inventorying and managing of those ships and shipwrecks that were related to the Provincial Marine. Next. So ultimately, looking at one of the ways we wanted to put basically the scope of and position our students was tying in the concept of the Royal Navy and of course of naval history within the Great Lakes, and position it within obviously the context of ships. Ships that were built for the Great Lakes environment, to the confines of the Great Lakes Basin. They had to be adapted, so Royal Navy design had to be adapted to a Great Lakes environment. And so this was important because we were able to share with students and the public the opportunity to look at fragments of our archaeological heritage and to piece it together, to reconstruct that history and to tell the story of the Provincial Marine in a way that it hadn't been previously told. Of course, HMS Nancy is on display at Wasaga, and it's a wonderful attraction. But we wanted to certainly contribute to Discovery Harbour's mission and, of course, to connecting with our submerged heritage. Next. And so we're able to do so using the legacy collections at the Discovery Harbour, in addition to the underwater cultural heritage that lies within Penetanguishene Bay, to tell that story, to recreate this part of history that unfortunately very few people know about. That we did have a naval marine unit in the Great Lakes, and that it was quite active and essential, of course, from the period of the 7 Years' War right through and past the 1820s and even through to the 1830s. So we are looking at not only documenting that heritage, but of course interpreting it both for the public, for the benefit of Huronia Historical Parks and their collections, but also to, of course, provide these opportunities for people to better understand the various cultural legacies within Georgian Bay, and to connect that, of course, with the histories of surveying and, of course, the later histories of commercial trade. Next. So we focus our attention, of course, on Penetanguishene's naval establishment, which really didn't get going, so to speak, until around the period of 1817, when, of course, a small outfit of ships would be used between Nottawasaga, the depot at Nottawasaga, and then eventually positioned at Penetanguishene for its deepwater harbor and, of course, surrounding environment, which was ideal for a naval force, to protect a naval force. And so Penetanguishene became the Royal Navy, or shall we say the Provincial Marines base, at obviously on Georgian Bay, and served in a very short period of time, but was still critical, of course, to the managing of the supplies and trade that was going on in Georgian Bay at that period. Next. And so today, Penetanguishene has been brought back to life in a reconstructed landscape. and one which again provides a perfect and ideal backdrop for teaching students and for sharing with the public this maritime history. Fortunately, due to a Millennium Grant, the Discovery Harbour was able to build a purpose-built facility for one of the Provincial Marines' ship, HMS Tecumseh, which I will show you shortly. But ultimately, she is only one of their vast collection, and which we are working toward mitigating the effects of time, but also to sharing the histories and connecting it with the local landscape. Yep, next. So it served as an ideal opportunity to run our very first field school in maritime archaeology there last summer. In June of 2018, we led a group of approximately 15 students to Penetang, and where they had 2 weeks of training in maritime archaeology methods. We ran them through a variety of land drills. They were given lectures and workshops relating to local heritage and, of course, how Great Lakes shipbuilding, the heritage of the Provincial Marine. And we were fortunate through our partnership with Discovery Harbour, it enabled this opportunity again to share this history to this generation. It's, given the room and the interests of history and maritime heritage perhaps in this room, it's much more difficult, I find, to train this younger generation in the merits and the opportunities that are availed in heritage. We're all sort of already gangbusters on it, but of course trying to bring that into universities, into academia today, when they're trying to steer students into the STEM, into other sciences, and trying to get them interested in the humanities and the cultural heritage, the importance of our cultural heritage, is a little bit more of a challenge. So we do have our work cut out for us, actually, as maritime archaeologists and of a new discipline here in Ontario. But the success of this summer's course was evident. Our students were thrilled, and they are going on into fields of cultural heritage management. Next. We had a number of opportunities to introduce them to experiential training. We worked with the ship's company at Penetanguishene, who were wonderful, and took a number of our students out for a sail, which again hit home the importance, of course, of the hands-on experience of being part of a cultural heritage landscape, and of course of a facility which helps to support maritime heritage. Next. And of course, through technologies, we're able to bring students into the 21st century. We used, as you can perhaps see in the corner there, the little red light against the timber backdrop. That's that's a Mavic Pro, a small drone that we're using to record actually the site and to create basically photogrammetric visuals of the ship and to monitor its deterioration, as it were, over time. We will continue to actually use drones in this capacity. They serve as very useful, quick and useful technology in which to record features of a ship and the changes over time. So annually, if this is done, we can record those changes and also provide a study for Discovery Harbour so that they can help to manage any stresses that are being placed on that ship. This is HMS Tecumseh, and she was built at the Chippewa in 1815. She serves, of course, today as the iconic exhibit at Penetang, and ultimately to showcase one of many of the Provincial Marine that were launched and built to serve, of course, the Great Lakes as a task force during the, just post-War of 1812, but and through the 1820s period. She didn't have too many, shall we say, kerfuffles, as many naval ships might have of the sort of 1812 period, but she did serve an important role as she monitored and managed, of course, our coastlines, and she moved people and goods across the Georgian Bay region. All right, next. So our photogrammetry results in, again, a way in which we can monitor any changes to the ship. And ultimately to see, of course, how obviously archaeology heritage management and conservation sciences meet in the middle to show our students the importance, of course, of managing collections. Because once we basically raise ships, like the Tecumseh was raised in the 1950s, she was removed by somebody who may be familiar to those in this room, Wilfred Jury, and ultimately the management program was not set in place before the ship had been removed, and she was basically left on the shoreline, essentially to rot. There was no management plan, and as a result, there is not much of the ship left today to really show the public. But it also teaches our students the sort of importance that we have to, a responsibility we have to cultural heritage, and especially marine cultural heritage, which requires a certain degree of conservation understanding in order to mitigate the effects of ships and shipwrecks that are removed, obviously, from the water. Next. So as part of this, again, managing these legacy collections, we are managing those within, obviously, the Penetanguishene Bay. Again, we employed our little Mavic Pro last year to monitor and record any shallow water shipwreck sites that are located within the bay. We also employed a lot of our students to undertake coastal and survey management of local shipwrecks so that we could actually position them geographically within Penetang, and to start to construct a database, a catalog of shipwrecks within the region. Again, this is one of the important roles that we have as maritime archaeologists, is to not only find those great and exciting shipwrecks, but to manage the ones that we have, the ones we know about, and to mitigate the effects to them as a result of ice, boats, and even diver effects over time. Next. And in fact, lying just off in Penetanguishene Bay, just off the foreshore, is HMS Nawash. Again, the sister ship to HMS Tecumseh, and also that was built at Chippewa in 1815, and ultimately made her way up to Georgian Bay, serving in the same role as the Tecumseh. And again, she's in very shallow water, the result of which we have to administer, we have to manage sites in extremely shallow waters because they become affected by the environment. And of course, with our lower lake levels, that has of course compromised opportunities with boats and their engines and motors. It also means that they're more compromised because of ice flow over the course of the winter. So all we can simply do, we're not necessarily going to move the shipwreck, we're not going to necessarily raise the shipwreck, but we can monitor any changes to the shipwreck and then potentially look at avenues to direct shipping around from where the shipwreck lies today. We're considering that, again, because of the sensitivity of this site and the importance of it. Again, one of the ships built in 1815, serving the Provincial Marine in that capacity, until approximately 1831, when they attempted to, the sale of naval goods from Penetanguishene occurred, and that included the Tecumseh, the Nawash, and 3 other gunboats, amongst other materials of the Provincial Marine, basically signaling the closure of Penetang as a naval depot, and ultimately the materials then finding their way into other exhibits and or other uses for the duration of the period of sail. Next. A number of other ships that we located using the drone were timber ships, lumber schooners that, again, tell us the story of that slightly later period of Penetanguishene Bay. Of the different types of ships that were, of course, employed in the trades in southern Georgian Bay. And so we'll have an opportunity to look at not only, again, these wonderful sites of naval importance, but, of course, those which, again, constituted our commercial marine, and tell the story of course, the importance of bulk, the high-volume, low-value bulk cargoes that were being exported from the Georgian Bay region. Next. One of our highlight projects over the course of our field course last year was this wonderful collection of ship timbers. Now, I may be one of the very few people in this room who gets very excited by ship timbers. And when I first met with Discovery Harbor to forge a partnership with them, the foreman for the organization at the time took me. He said, "Oh, you know, we have a few ship timbers in a shed you might want to see. I bet you get excited about that." And sure enough, took me into this shed, and there's literally an entirety of a ship, well, or what was remained of that ship, lying in this shed, and literally. So, of course, I was excited, and it also lent itself to a wonderful reconstruction project for students. So, actually, next. So ultimately, the timbers, the individual timbers, we were able to look at, to record, from ship's fasteners to the different types of positions where those fasteners were. The amount of ironwork actually in those timbers, which was remarkable, I found, since at that period of time, a lot of the ironwork would have been brought in from the UK and certainly from Kingston Dockyard. So ultimately, there were a lot of initial assessments that I made, but then the question, of course, is who was she? You know, where did she come from, and how did she end up in the shed? So a lot of the backstory was part of the investigative work with our field course students last year, was to basically follow the backstory of the ship and where and how she'd made it to that shed. And I'm going to give you a little bit here. Next. So this was her originally, actually earlier than HMS Tecumseh, which was raised from Penetang Bay in the 1950s. The Tigress, or as they thought she was, the Tigress, one of two ships that had been taken by the British in Georgian Bay. And ultimately the ship, in fact, made her way down to Lake Erie. It was definitely not the Tigress, and sank actually somewhere in Lake Erie. But at the time when she was raised, in the late 1920s, they brought her aboard, and again, she had this association for really right up and through till the 1990s. They continued to believe she was this vessel. Only through, again, the historical archival research did colleagues of mine at Penetang, a gentleman by the name of Burke Penny and Patrick Folks, who are wonderful historians and archaeologists, but were able to reconstruct the story about who she was and where she was from. So certainly we know that this was the ship. We know that this ship did end up within the collections of Discovery Harbor, and we are so grateful that there were individuals within Discovery Harbor that had the foresight to actually hold on to those timbers. And perhaps a different group of people and a different thought process, they might have basically just turned over those timbers as firewood or something other. So we're very grateful to have the opportunity to record them now. Next. So question was, what was she? And we know that if she was raised from Penetanguishene Bay, there were a number of the ships of the Provincial Marine that were actually abandoned within the bay. 3 of those ships, in fact, were believed to be something called Durham boats, also variously called gunboats. And the reason for this was, of course, the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which again forced the limitation of naval arms on the lakes. Often many of these ships would have been termed Durham boats, to not give out the sensational idea that they were gunboats carrying arms, and therefore they could still be employed in a naval and marine capacity, but without, again, the intention that they were going to bear arms and take our American comrades. So ultimately they were variously termed, and this was essentially what they would have looked like. Largely open boats with 1 to 2 masts, and again, a small group of men obviously handling sails and cargoes aboard them. Next. And for those of you who've been to Discovery Harbor, you'll probably be familiar with the reconstruction of the Bee. Now again, she wasn't built on any specific lines plans or any particular specifics for a Durham or a gunboat, but generally speaking, she provides you an idea of what the form would have been for one of these small vessels operating within southern Georgian Bay of that period. Next. So we are looking at 3 potential sites that lie within Georgian Bay, one of which I think we have in the shed. So the bee and the wasp and the mosquito, lovely names, of course, very Georgian Bay-like. But of course, we have an opportunity to look at the nature of these ships, to really consider them, and consider the challenges posed, of course, by running an establishment, but also realizing that you had to manage your arms, and you had to manage the naval associations of your particular establishment within certain confines. And so to call your boats Durham boats was not such a hardship. They served their role. They would also be obviously fitted with at least 1 gun on board. And of course the men would be carrying a number of small arms as well. So again, if the need arose, they could certainly call to arms. But in this particular case, they didn't see too much action. They served a vital role for the Marine, but not so much in a military capacity for that period, or at least in a naval and in a battle call to arms type capacity. So we're continuing to sort of uncover the histories of these ships and to determine really who we have in that shed. There are, of course, lots of features which may err on one or the other. And again, we need more time, of course, in our shed to record further timbers. But we're approximately about a third of the way through the timbers in the shed. So we should get through quite a number more over the course of this following summer, and may have better information for you by next year. Next. So just a couple of our students who were recording some of the features of the bow assembly actually within the our little shed area. Again, thanks to one of our kind members, they cleaned. It was quite a dirty space to work with in the beginning for our students, but we've actually managed to use photogrammetry. We photographed quite a number of them. And we're beginning our catalog of those timbers, much like we are cataloging the shipwrecks within the bay. Next. And of course, using different technologies, using photogrammetry, again, to record individual timbers. So we have 3-dimensional image of each of those timbers with the goal that we are going to reconstruct this boat. And again, to demonstrate the surviving elements, archaeologically speaking, but of course within the lines plan of a gunboat for that period. Some of you may have been to Mallory Town and have seen the gunboat there within their collection. So we will no doubt begin a correspondence with those individuals, and to again see where she fits in the realm of gunboat typologies within the Great Lakes. Next. Now, of course, I'm a marine archaeologist, and one would assume that I dive as part of my profession, which I do. When I returned back to Canada, one of the challenges I encountered was that the Ministry of Labour basically says we, as employed members of the marine scientific community, could not dive and could not train our students in marine archaeological methods. That makes it difficult when you're trying to teach them how to do marine archaeology. But I'd like to say that we've, through the images that I've shown you here, we've managed to find a way to still teach them, but without taking them diving. So long as essentially we bring our students in as volunteers, and we ourselves are volunteers on those projects, we're able to take them surveying, do any sort of work we want to with them, which is great news, and which is how we've managed to do our work so far. So as part of last summer's work, we took the weekend off, and we went and obviously took them to dive on Great Lakes shipwrecks, to show them how to set a baseline, for them to understand and to see shipbuilding in action, to understand the components of ships, and of course the opportunity to just actually see a Great Lakes shipwreck, and particularly one which is both intact and another which was slightly more broken up, so they understood some of the important characteristics of Great Lakes ships, such as centerboards, which obviously gave lateral resistance to a vessel when it was underway, but was able to be raised when navigating through shallow harbors and canal locks. So our RecMap project, which we began last year, is going to enable us to, again, provide a catalog of Great Lakes shipwrecks, but to monitor them using advanced visualization techniques. Things such as photogrammetry, which I've mentioned, using drones, but also using technology called laser scanning. But we can actually undertake laser scanning now underwater. And so we can help to build a basically web framework that, again, builds a vessel from the keel up and allows us to position all points within a web framework so that we have an accurate design of the ship as she exists underwater. We are beginning that work, in fact, this year, and with additional technologies, we just learned that, and this one's for you, Fred, that our Center for Innovation grant came in, which means we now have all the technologies at our disposal to map and record Great Lakes shipwrecks, including multi-beam sonar and side-scan sonar. So that's great news for us at Trent, and ultimately will allow us to do much more work over a wider span of area within Georgian Bay. Next. So initially, without using laser scanning technology last year, we basically did a simple one-day survey of 2 shipwrecks to really see how quickly, again, and effectively our photogrammetry work would provide a vehicle in which to map these shipwrecks quickly and cost-effectively. And so the first vessel we dove on last year was, in fact, the Marquette. Some of you may be familiar with the vessel, just general histories of Great Lakes. She was actually bound here to the Port of Collingwood in 1866, carrying a cargo of 20,000 bushels of corn, bound from the Port of Chicago to Collingwood, unfortunately not making it, and coming to rest just off Hope Island. In fact, her cargo of corn was consigned to Gooderham and Worts. So she actually, it's a bit of the archaeology of consumption here. So again, it's these wonderful connections with the histories of these vessels, from Chicago to Collingwood, and then for transshipment to Toronto and Gooderham and Worts distillery. So again, she gave us an opportunity to re-record a vessel that had been recorded by a local organization called the Ontario Marine Heritage Committee. And they're a group of volunteers who document shipwrecks across the Great Lakes and who we've been working with. And basically overlaying their original map from the 1980s with a photogrammetric visual of the site. And then looking down lower is the Lottie Wolf, a Welland sailing canal ship that, again, will tell us more about this very important vessel type, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. But again, showing you 2 types of ships, one which is fairly intact, one which shows it a much wider distribution area, and archaeologically speaking, that's important. People have always, to me, said, ooh, intact shipwrecks are fantastic, but I quite like the puzzle of putting together a shipwreck, and the opportunity for us to study features which are not visually accessible when they are intact, to study those components, again, from centerboards, to parts, features within the bow assembly of the vessel. Okay, next. And so, of course, this does lead me into a talk on Welland sailing canal ships and the importance of this vessel to the Great Lakes. It's the opportunity, of course, to connect our work in Georgian Bay with our work in Niagara, to me, is so important. It demonstrates, obviously, that it is all maritime heritage, it's all interconnected through our Great Lakes system. But of course, the importance of that lies within the opportunities that it presents to connect communities, and communities which were inevitably interrelated during the period of sail within the Great Lakes region. Next. So, yeah, just to tie up, our Trent University program, again, will continue this year. We are running it as a blended course, meaning that we're doing a 2-week online course and then 1 week actually on site. And it's not limited to students. I think we had a number of people in their 60s and 50s that joined us last year. It is a land-based course, and you do not have to dive with it. But it gives you an introduction to maritime archaeology and what it's about, looking at historical landscapes, and ultimately to learning about these wonderfully preserved legacy collections that relate to Georgian Bay history. So again, for those who are interested, I can provide you some more contact information later, but let's move on to our next project. So I was ecstatic to receive federal funding for a project that has been in my sights for about 20 years. Happened to be a shipyard, so some of you will know something about one of those. But a slightly older shipyard, or certainly one that had been in use for from an earlier period. The opportunity to look at shipyards, the historic structure of shipyards is incredibly rare. We often don't have these opportunities because the sites on which they are located have often been developed and are literally now sitting under condos or other developments. And so to actually be able to connect a shipyard to the ships that are sailing on the Great, or were sailing on the Great Lakes, is such an opportunity as an archaeologist to study that infrastructure, to connect landscapes both underwater with their terrestrial counterparts, but also to connect the individuals that were part of the development of shipbuilding within the Great Lakes region. All right, next. So for me, this journey began as an undergraduate student at Western, when I began a survey of a shipwreck called the Sligo that sank at the western entrance to Toronto Harbour. The photo mosaic you see here was a compilation of about 165 photographs, and ultimately providing an opportunity to visualize a shipwreck for the public so that they can connect with that underwater heritage. Often you see images like I showed you with the Lottie Wolf, just one picture of a shipwreck site. But to actually visualize the entire site is important, to put it in perspective, to show you features up at the bow, where just to the far left, and to her stern assembly, which is quite broken up here to the right. Her wheel is actually just sitting there off the stern to the right. But it also shows how a ship forms over time. Her railings sitting obviously alongside her port and starboard sections. Her huge cargo compartments along her center line, which again demonstrate to us the importance of these high volume, low value bulk carriers to the Great Lakes region. The study of ships both in their on their historic terms, but also the archaeology of the sites is so exciting when we can connect the two, both documents and actual site information. And this particular ship, I actually did a complete history on, from the time she was built at the Shikluna shipyards in 1860, where she was put into a test of direct trade between the Great Lakes and Liverpool in 1862. And then would remain within the Great Lakes up until through the rest of her career, refitted as a fore and aft schooner, and then was cut down to a schooner barge. It's those wonderful histories when you see a ship in all its dimensions, with all the people and the individuals that were associated with them, that really brings this history to life. I find it so fascinating, both the history as much as I do the archaeology. And so it was with this ship in mind that I obviously put in for our grant funding, to be able to study this shipwreck in light, of course, that we have access to the shipyard in which she was built. It's just such an exciting opportunity. Okay, next. So extreme canalers, what were canalers themselves? What were Welland sailing canal ships? These were basically the 18-wheelers of their day. They were the ships that moved these cargoes from the upper lakes through to ports of Chicago, down Lake Huron, and through to Lake Erie and onto Lake Ontario. They were usually commuting cargoes that included corn, wheat, salt, amongst others. And again, they were critical to economic development within the Great Lakes region. They were very boxy, as you can probably tell by having these bluff bows and square sterns, characteristic of these canalers. They were fitted with a centerboard, again, allowing them to navigate the narrow confines of the Welland Canal at that time, between 1846 and 1881, when a maximum dimension of the ship that was able to transit the canal was approximately 140 feet by 26 feet in beam. And these ships used that entirety of space. They were one large cargo carrying space, and ultimately were later fitted with shifting boards, because of course the nature of these open cargoes meant that it made these ships very unwieldy when they were caught in a bit of a storm, a bit of weather, and ultimately resulting also in a very large loss of life. So the opportunity to study these canals with their cockbill jib booms, which helped to enable their forward rigging, to move away, of course, and up, and ultimately telling a story of the necessity of how the environment, how our geography created our vessels, how they developed this vessel that you see today in the form of our Lakers on the across the Great Lakes. Actually, next. Oh, yeah, okay. So they certainly tell, and they paint a picture, of course, of the towns in which they were built. Of ports such as St. Catharines, where many of these Welland sailing canal ships were launched by builders such as Scicluna, who knew that it was important to build on this opportunity, to build ships that could navigate these narrow locks that were basically the bottleneck within the Great Lakes. If ships wanted to move cargo through onto Lake Ontario, they had to conform to those lock dimensions. And St. Catharines provides a great opportunity to look at the infrastructure for the Great Lakes, of industry and of development that met, obviously, the needs of both the canals and of lake transport. And the Scicluna shipyard, situated just over there on the left-hand side, you see a sort of sock-looking basin, is the focus of our study. Certainly in terms today, the Scicluna shipyards are no more. Downtown St. Catharines is unrecognizable. But the evidence of that history remains, and unfortunately remains buried for archaeologists like us to discover. So next. So ultimately, our Lakers today connect with this important history of the importance of the St. Lawrence Seaway, and of course of the ships that continue to serve the Great Lakes region. For those of you who may have sort of kept up on the news, of course, the Seaway just opened last week, and the top hat ceremonies went off with great success. I think one of the captains got 2 hats, so well done you. And you can imagine also the importance of connecting us with, of course, modern lake transport, to bring the past to the present, but also to make sure people are aware of where these ships came from, and where, of course, the sacrifices and legacies of these individuals heralded from. Okay, next. And at the heart of our study is this wonderful man, this Maltese immigrant, who is not only a shipbuilder, but he was also a city councillor. He was a philanthropist, and most importantly, he was a citizen of St. Catharines. He basically brought to St. Catharines, or infused 200 million into the Canadian economy during the 19th century. He built between 150 to 200 ships. Now, I don't know about the Collingwood shipyards, but for the mid-19th century, that is quite a number. And we're not talking just small boats here. He did build a number of tugs and workboats, but he built most of his ships to canal dimensions. And Scicluna had started his life in Malta in 1808 and emigrated to North America when he was 16, worked the trades, worked the Atlantic trades for a short period of time, but then worked on ships in the Erie Canal and then in Quebec, contributing to the construction of the SS Royal William, which became one of the first ships actually to make the crossing entirely on steam power. So he had a long legacy even before he established his shipyard on 12 Mile Creek. in 1838. Next. And at the shipyard, of course, he was building ships of all sizes and dimensions. His location on 12 Mile Creek, on the Second Welland Canal, which was basically where all ships would have had to have basically passed by, was ideal. He became notorious and noted as not only a shipbuilder, but contributing to ship repair and maintenance. And ultimately, that legacy brought opportunities to repair any ships and to provide additional materials to fit out ships over the course of the 19th century. And unfortunately, his legacy would end in 1880 with his son taking over the yard. And ultimately, the yard then producing purely steam-powered propellers until approximately about 1891, when the actual site was leased to a basket-making company for a short period of time, before being abandoned in about 1901. But as a shipyard itself, it actually had begun in 1827 under a man by the name of Russell Armington, building ships for the first Welland Canal, before Scicluna took over and built ships for the second canal, and then his son building for the third Welland Canal, which actually took a new, was on a new portion of the Niagara landscape by 1881. Next. So our project actually, through Brock University, wearing my other hat, is basically focusing on a shipyard, but it looks at the opportunities of connecting multidisciplinary approaches to the way we look at archaeology, to looking at how we re-engage historic environments, and particularly maritime environments, which have long since been forgotten. We connect a number of different specialties through our work, and my colleagues who range across geography and earth sciences, the digital humanities, are all excellent in what they do and bringing our research to life through their specialties. We are engaging the local community through various outreach activities, partnerships through universities, and looking towards a program of management of historic landscapes, historic maritime landscapes for the future. So, whereby we can interpret those landscapes and make them more accessible. Often we forget about these wonderful historic waterways, such as obviously the Port of Collingwood, and ways in which we can take those environments and use them or actively reuse them in a way that makes them more user-friendly, but also makes their histories accessible. So that's part of what my goal is with this research, is that we are making history accessible again, and also providing an opportunity to document a very important site. Next. And so our project fieldwork, for those of you who are familiar with the Niagara area, and St. Catharines specifically, you can see us from the 406 while you're driving by, but don't look too closely, obviously. There's a very large, well, still a pink fire training tower, which has been in the bane of our existence, actually, for the last year. It was, in fact, actually, as we were beginning our work last summer, we were told that there would be a new fire training tower basically dropped on our shipyard, and that, of course, the city needs the services, and I'm so glad for them that they're relocating to Meriton. So our shipyard is saved and our work can continue. But we're also not only looking at the shipyard, but we're looking at a double dry dock that Scicluna employed to, again, add to his growing success in building and repair. So we have two major sites which we're going to be looking at next. And within the shipyard itself, we're looking at a number of different buildings. Our GIS specialist, Colleen Beard, is graphically illustrating all the buildings that are on the original 1851s, 1860s, and 1870 maps, so that we start to piece together the different buildings used on the site over its duration. It's providing an excellent opportunity to sort of see the site before, obviously, we excavate, to mitigate the amount of excavation work we undertake, but also to look at ways in which we can better interpret the site as part of our long-term initiatives. So we have a number of different interesting sites that we are going to be looking at. We'll probably begin in the boat manufacturing, and ultimately also test a few of the dwellings, the laborer houses. Scicluna employed up to 300 men at one time across his shipyard and dry docks. So we have an opportunity to look at the personal histories that are connected with the shipyard and to tell those stories as well, which is important. We forget when we're doing archaeology, we are looking at the individuals at the heart of those studies as much as we're looking at the infrastructures and the bit of boat. Next. And of course, we're looking at all the remains that exist within the yard, the side of the buildings, the workspaces, the slipways. We are looking at the various remains that exist as a result of the shipbuilding process. But of course, we're also looking at the human material that's left and abandoned within the yard basin. Next. And most importantly, there's always a ship involved. And here, actually, we have an opportunity to document the ship in the shipyard, so no longer a ship in a shed, but a ship in a shipyard. And ultimately, she was built at Port Robinson in 1854, had a, well, one could say it was a fairly successful career, but she sank 3 times over the course of 1854 and 1870, and ultimately then was refitted at the Scicluna shipyard in 1871, and then put back into the service of, again, the canaling trades of high volume, low valuable cargoes, until she was brought back to the shipyard and abandoned there in the late 1880s. So we have an actual canaler within our shipyard, which for me is such a wonder, because I've always had to create photomosaics or find a vehicle in which to get the public to see what we see when we're down there. But now they actually have this wonderful viewing platform called the Burgoyne Bridge, and they'll actually be able to stand on the Burgoyne Bridge and see as we obviously begin our excavations of the ship lying within the shipyard basin. So we have, it's an exciting dig. We are running a field school associated with it through Brock University, a 5-week field school. Again, people don't have to be students. If your knees aren't so bad and they can handle 5 weeks of a bit of a dig, we're going to be teaching people about maritime history, artifacts, the Great Lakes cultural, historic cultural studies. We're providing opportunities for them to connect with the Great Lakes landscape, but through the course of a shipyard excavation. Next. And of course, as ever, one of the biggest goals in what I do is public archaeology, is to reach audiences like you, to give talks, to obviously find ways, vehicles in which we can get our academic information out there, to train students, to train the public in what we do, for them to be aware of our maritime cultural record. We're going to be planning 2 open days, one in July and one in August at the shipyard, for people to come down and visit, to experience a Victoriana-themed shipyard experience. We'll be running this field school, we'll be delivering more public talks, and we're going to be developing the educational materials surrounding this, so that the only educational materials in Niagara seems to be 1812 material, but again, to tell them of that important later history, the impacts of industrialization to the Welland Canals region. We're also looking at other programs in which to reach people digitally and through 1-week shorter dig programs. We have a very active Facebook group, so if anybody wants to reach out to us, we're at Scicluna Shipyard. And ultimately we'll be doing a number of different documentaries and radio programs over the course of this coming summer. It's going to be a busy summer. And again, we'd love to obviously share the information that we're doing as we progress with our shipyard program, but also, of course, with the opportunities presented at Penetanguishene through our Trent program. And ultimately, next. So again, if you're interested in information on how to reach us, at least for the Brock program, feel free to reach us on any of these accounts. If you reach the shipyard at brocku.ca account, you will reach me. Again, if you have any questions, you're very welcome to direct them there. And again, if you happen to Niagara to do a little wine and visit to a dig, then I think that's a nice nice merging of skills actually. Drinking wine and visiting a shipyard. So I think Collingwood needs to get into that. All right, and next. So, it's been a pleasure to speak with you, to tell you a little bit about what I do and about the shipwrecks in my life. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.